Welcome to Module 3 of the July 2022 Title VI training for Nebraska Department of Transportation subrecipients and local public agencies. In this module, we'll be discussing limited English proficiency, including a little bit about LEP data collection and links to example documents. For some background and context, a precursor to Executive Order 13166, which is really the foundation of limited English proficiency for our training today, but a precursor is the Supreme Court case Lau v. Nichols. In 1971, as a result of school desegregation, about 3,000 Chinese students who were not fluent in English were integrated into San Francisco public schools. Only about 1,000 of those students were provided supplemental English instruction. Of the other 1,800 to 2,000 Chinese students who were not fluent in English, many were placed in special education classes, and keep this in mind a few slides from now, while some others were forced to just repeat the same grade for years. The school system argued that since a uniform policy was used for all students, a facially neutral policy, and the school district didn't intentionally discriminate against students with limited English proficiency, that equal protection had been provided. Well, the case worked its way to the Supreme Court, and in 1974, the U.S. Supreme Court disagreed with the school system and unanimously decided that the lack of supplemental language instruction in public schools for students with limited English proficiency violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Specifically, the court held that since non-English speakers were denied a meaningful education, the disparate impact caused by the school policy violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the year 2000, Executive Order 13166 was signed. The full title is Access to Federally Assisted Programs for Persons of Limited English Proficiency. It expands upon the national origin protection from Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as we just saw in the prior slide. In certain circumstances, failure to ensure that LEP persons can effectively participate in or benefit from federally assisted programs or activities may violate Title VI regulations against national origin discrimination. Executive Order 13166 requires federal agencies and federal aid recipients to examine the services they provide, identify any need for services to those with limited English proficiency, and develop and implement a system to provide those services so LEP persons can have meaningful access to them. There are no laws or regulations applicable to the US DOT or FHWA programs on the topic of LEP, as there are with, for example, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Aside from the general Title VI provisions, which includes national origin as a protected class, which of course limited English proficiency arises from. The most recent US DOT guidance, though, is found in the Federal Register at 70 FR 74087 to 74100. Those are page numbers, essentially. They can be thought of as such. This guidance is titled policy guidance concerning recipients' responsibilities to limited English proficient persons. And included in that guidance are a lot of the foundational requirements for much of what this module covers. So, who is considered a person with limited English proficiency? A person of limited English proficiency is defined as one who does not speak English as their primary language and who also has a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. And as the next slide will show, it's important to recognize that this is not a disability. It is true that the provision of translations and interpreters are somewhat analogous to the ADA's requirement for communication aids and services, but limited English proficiency is not considered a disability. We'll be discussing disability in a lot of detail in Module 4, but I have seen this line blurred enough times that I decided to make a slide about it. Limited English proficiency individuals are those who have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. LEP persons are generally able to speak a primary language, it's just not the English language. A disability, on the other hand, is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, such as seeing, hearing, speaking, and so forth. Certain disabled persons may not be able to speak any language, English or otherwise. LEP services will be described in an agency's LEP plan. They won't be included in an agency's Americans with Disabilities Act plan or in those disability-related policies, as I've seen before. In the state of Nebraska, English is overwhelmingly the only language that people speak. And as shown in the chart, 88.2% of the residents of Nebraska, as of the 2020 5-year American Community Survey data, only speak English and do not speak another language. Now, this doesn't mean that individual localities can't have very high percentages of LEP persons. Now we'll talk about general limited English proficiency compliance requirements for local agencies and subrecipients of federal assistance through the NDOT. And these requirements, keep in mind as we go through these, that they assume that an agency is creating a limited English proficiency plan. Recipients must take reasonable steps to ensure meaningful access to their programs and activities by limited English proficiency persons. This is a very broad, very fact-dependent standard. It's designed to ensure meaningful access by LEP persons to critical services while not imposing undue burdens on small businesses, small local governments, or small nonprofits. Because the requirements for limited English proficiency, as we'll see in upcoming slides, are so dependent on the particular circumstances of each recipient or each local agency, documentation is extremely important. Make a record of your analysis and keep records of the agency's interactions with limited English proficient persons to the degree that you're able. Local agencies or NDOT subrecipients must work through a 4-factor analysis, which helps establish the size of the area's LEP population and the frequency of LEP encounters, both of which are factors that will affect the reasonableness of the language assistance measures that the agency decides to provide. And again, just as with the previous slide, because of the flexibility of the factors, because of how specific the analysis will be to each local agency, each LEP plan will be unique to your particular area. And so documentation is enormously important. So now let's work through the four-factor analysis and look at the items that the US DOT guidance says that local agencies and recipients of federal assistance need to work through in order to create their LEP strategy. The first factor is to determine the number or proportion of LEP persons served or encountered in the eligible service population. That's generally going to mean the population of your locality, of your city, of your county, and so forth. The greater the number or proportion of LEP persons from a particular language group present in your service population, the more likely it is that language services are going to be needed. Local agencies, in working through this first factor, might consult data from the census, maybe from community organizations or their own school systems, maybe other state and local governments, religious organizations, or maybe legal aid entities. There are lots of sources of data when you're working through factor one. It's recommended that a local agency become familiar with the U.S. Census data for your service area, including the American Community Survey data. The American Community Survey is a U.S. Census product on languages spoken at home in your service area. I've included two links on this slide. The first is for data.census.gov, which is the U.S. Census searchable website that will return data for your locality. The second link is to an FHWA tutorial on how to use data.census.gov in order to return limited English proficiency data for use in your four-factor analysis. Factor two of the four-factor analysis is to determine the frequency with which LEP individuals come into contact with your programs, activities, or services. Recipients or LPAs should assess as accurately as possible the frequency with which they have or should have contact with LEP individuals from different language groups seeking assistance. Local agencies need to have a process for employees who have contact with LEP persons to document those encounters. The more frequent the contact, the more likely it is that enhanced language services should be provided. The steps that are reasonable for a recipient that serves an LEP person on a one-time basis every once in a while are going to be very different than the expectations for a recipient that serves LEP persons on a daily basis. It's important to review the relevant programs, services, or activities that you provide for evidence of LEP encounters. If you haven't been keeping or collecting this kind of data, even anecdotal evidence is useful at this stage. Our agency knows that we communicate with LEP persons in this unit or in this department or when we perform this service or activity. If you haven't been keeping data on LEP encounters, though, that kind of knowledge is still very helpful, that anecdotal knowledge. The agency should consult directly with LEP persons to determine their usage of services. For example, your agency may elect to conduct a survey of LEP persons, and you'll likely need to coordinate with community organizations to administer the survey, and you'll need to translate the information in the survey. Finally, recipients should consider whether appropriate outreach to LEP persons could increase the frequency of contact with LEP language groups. For the third factor, a local agency should consider the nature and importance of each program, activity, or service that is provided. To put it plainly, the more important the activity or information or service or program, or the greater the possible consequences to the LEP of not understanding what's happening, the more likely it is that language services are going to be needed. A locality needs to determine whether denial or delay of access to services or information could have serious or even life-threatening implications for the LEP individual. Your agency should identify what programs or activities would have serious consequences to actual and potential beneficiaries if language barriers prevented or delayed a person from benefiting from the activity. Emergency services might be an example of this. Finally, an agency should consider the resources available and the costs of language services. A locality's level of resources and the costs imposed may have an impact on the nature of the steps it should take in providing meaningful access for LEP persons. Smaller localities with more limited budgets are not expected to provide the same level of language services as larger recipients with larger budgets. To put it another way, reasonable steps or reasonable language assistance measures might cease to be reasonable when the costs imposed substantially exceed the benefits. Cost issues, however, can often be reduced by technological advances, reasonable business practices, and the sharing of language assistance measures and services among localities. For example, a city and the county in which it is located might share language assistance services. When looking at the costs of language services, localities should be able to articulate through documentation or in some other reasonable manner their process for determining that language services are going to be limited based on the cost. They should inventory language assistance measures that are currently being provided along with the associated costs and determine, based on the other factors in this analysis, what, if any, additional services are needed in order to provide meaningful access. And then an agency should analyze their budget. To the extent practicable, an agency should consider what percentage of the agency's capital or operating budget could be devoted to additional language assistance expenses if they're needed. An agency should consider cost-effective practices for providing language services. The agency may have access to language assistance products that have been developed and paid for by local or regional or state government agencies. An agency might also have bilingual staff that could provide language assistance. Documentation in Factor 4, as with the other factors, but particularly in Factor 4, is very, very important. It may well be true that your agency does not have the financial resources to provide language assistance measures or to provide all of the language assistance measures that the other three factors of the analysis seem to indicate would be reasonable. That may well be true, but the FHWA or the NDOT, when they look at your limited English proficiency plan and your four-factor analysis, they're going to want to see evidence that that is true. They're going to want to see a real analysis that you've looked at costs and you've looked at the language assistance measures that might be reasonable, and you've determined based on the budget and on the reasonableness of the language assistance measures that some things can be provided and others cannot because of cost. So be sure to do your documentation for Factor 4. Following the four-factor analysis, each recipient or local agency should create a limited English proficiency plan to implement the language assistance measures incorporating the four-factor analysis. While the LEP plan standards are designed to be flexible and fact-dependent, there are a few elements that are always present in a successful LEP plan, and we'll discuss those on the following slides. An LEP implementation plan should include a description of ways to identify LEP individuals who need language assistance. The data collected from this process will help in future applications of the first two factors of the four-factor analysis. A local agency should develop ways of identifying LEP individuals who need language assistance. Now, I've placed a graphic in this slide. One way to do this particularly for walk-in LEP persons, is to use an I Speak card. What this is a card that has, you can see it says there in English, mark this box if you read or speak English. It says that same thing in about 40 or 50 different languages. And you could invite the LEP person, if you're not sure which language they're speaking, to look at that card and identify their language needs. An LEP implementation plan should describe the language assistance measures that the agency intends to provide. It should describe the types of language services that are available, how the staff of the agency can access those services, how they ought to respond to LEP callers, and how to respond to written communications from LEP persons, how to respond to LEP persons who have in-person contact with staff of the local agency, and then also how to ensure the competency of translators and interpreters. As with the Title VI implementation plan that we talked about in a prior module, the LEP implementation plan should include a section on how the agency's staff will be trained. Staff members should know their obligation to provide meaningful access to information and services to LEP persons, and all employees in public contact positions should be properly trained to work effectively with in-person and telephone interpreters. Localities might want to provide this training as part of orientation for new employees. However, a local agency or a recipient has flexibility in deciding the manner in which the training will be provided. As always, the NDOT Civil Rights Office and Project Solutions, Inc. are available to provide limited English proficiency training. Your LEP plan should include a description of how your agency will provide notice to LEP persons that language services are available. Again, this is very similar to the notification requirement that we discussed in Title VI when we looked at Module 2. The notice should be provided in languages that the LEP persons would understand, and I've seen this before. It's not very helpful to place a notice in English that LEP services will be provided, because by definition, an LEP person will not be able to understand that notice. Notification methods might include posting signs in entry areas and at other access points, stating in your outreach documents that language services are available, working with community organizations to inform LEP persons of the local agency services, placing ads or notices in local newspapers or other media, especially if you have alternate language media, although I know in Nebraska, outside of maybe Omaha and I think there's a publication out in Hastings, Grand Island, Kearney area, Lexington as well maybe. Outside of those locations, alternate language media is pretty rare in Nebraska. But alternate language media is a great resource if your locality has something like that. And then finally, providing presentations or notices at schools or religious organizations. Finally, your LEP plan should have a little discussion about how the plan will be monitored and updated. There is no definite time requirement for updates, but the best practice is to assess on an ongoing basis whether new documents or programs or services need to be made accessible for LEP persons. The plan should certainly be updated when changes in the demographics or types of services or other needs require it. It might also be helpful to seek feedback from the community as to whether or not the plan is working, and if there are tweaks that need to be made, it could be updated following seeking feedback in this way. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about selecting language services. Recipients or local agencies may provide language services in either oral or written form. In most cases, The locality should provide a mixture of both, depending on the circumstances of the LEP population in your area. The correct mix is going to be based on what is both reasonable and necessary in light of the four-factor analysis. So recipients have substantial flexibility in determining the appropriate mix as long as it is grounded in the results of the analysis. Whether oral or written, quality and accuracy of the language services are critical in order to avoid serious consequences to the LEP person and also perhaps to the recipient. An agency should consider on-site interpreters for critical services provided to a high volume of LEP persons. Interpretation is the act of listening to something in one language, the source language, and orally translating it into another language, the target language. If on-site interpreters are not available, or if a local agency doesn't have bilingual staff, access to interpreters is available through commercial telephone translation services. Recipients should ensure the competency of the language service providers. Interpreters don't need to be licensed, but they should demonstrate proficiency in and the ability to communicate information accurately in both English and the source language. It's really helpful too for interpreters to have knowledge in both languages of any specialized terms or concepts peculiar to the recipient's program. In this case, maybe transportation or highway construction related terms or concepts. It's also helpful for the interpreter to know any particular vocabulary and phraseology used by the LEP person. Interpreters must understand and adhere to their role as interpreters without deviating into a role as a counselor or a legal advisor or some other role. And also, interpreters must understand and follow confidentiality and impartiality rules to the same extent as the recipient employee for whom they are interpreting, or to the same extent that the position requires. When examining written language services, recipients might consider the translation of an entire document or the translation of a short description of the document. It really depends on the importance of the document in question. Translation is the replacement of a written text from one language, the source language, into an equivalent written text in another language, the target language. Vital written materials should be translated into the most frequently encountered LEP languages. Vital depends on the importance of the program, information, encounter, or service involved, and the consequence to the LEP person if the information in question is not accurate or timely. Recipients are encouraged to create a plan for consistently determining which documents or forms or applications are vital to the meaningful access of the LEP populations they serve. Community organizations may be helpful in determining what materials might be the most important to translate, and some such translations may be made even more effective when done in tandem with other outreach methods, including using media or schools or religious and community organizations to spread a message. Now, having said that, generally speaking, some examples of vital documents might include driver's license, auto registration and parking permit forms, parking tickets, citation forms, and violation or deficiency notices, emergency transportation information, markings, signs, and packaging for hazardous materials and substances, signs in bus and train stations and in airports, notices of public hearings regarding recipients' proposed transportation plans or projects, or changes in or reduction of, denial of services or benefits. And then finally, signs in waiting rooms, reception areas, and other initial points of entry, including notices advising LEP individuals of free language assistance. Many recipients would like to guarantee with greater certainty that they're complying with their obligations to provide written translations in languages other than English. And so if a recipient provides written translations under these following circumstances, such action will be considered strong evidence, not dispositive evidence, but strong evidence of compliance with the recipient's Title VI LEP obligations. This so-called safe harbor applies to the translation of written documents only, and it does not affect the general duty or requirement to provide meaningful access to LEP persons through qualified interpreters where oral language services are needed and are reasonable. A recipient can take advantage of the so-called safe harbor provision by providing written translations of vital documents in the following circumstances. For each eligible LEP language group that constitutes 5% or 1,000 persons, whichever is less of the population of persons eligible to be served or likely to be encountered, that is, that an agency would translate vital documents in those languages, or if fewer than 50 persons in a language group that reaches the 5% trigger, the recipient would not translate vital written materials, but would provide written notice in that LEP language group of the right to receive competent oral interpretation of those written materials free of cost. If a recipient does one or both of these things, it will be considered strong evidence that the recipient is complying with its limited English proficiency obligations. In this slide, I've included a link to an example limited English proficiency plan. This is the LEP plan for the Nebraska Department of Transportation. In this LEP plan, you'll find the NDOT's 4-factor analysis and then also discussion about the language assistance measures that the NDOT has opted to provide. This is a good template, I think, for local agencies to use to base their LEP plan off of. But again, keep in mind, because the 4-factor analysis is so specific to the individual local agency, and the results of the 4-factor analysis are going to be specific to the individual local agency. Not every LPA's LEP plan or recipient's LEP plan is expected to look exactly like the NDOT's LEP plan. If you have any questions on this module, please feel free to contact me at the contact information that's provided on this slide. You might also contact the Nebraska Department of Transportation Civil Rights Office, and their contact information is located on the first slide of this module.